Phillip. So in this video, we're going to try and answer the question, why do we have first-year composition classes? Now, I don't mean that in the sort of, I'm a first-year student who basically doesn't want to take gen eds, and so I'm arguing against first-year composition as part of my argument that I should only have to take classes in my major. No, that's not what I'm talking about. And I'm deeply unconvinced by that argument, but that is a topic for another video. I'm talking about what we as instructors in first-year composition courses, what universities who require first-year composition courses, what rhetoric and composition as a discipline think the purpose of this type of class is. And it's worth sort of stating this overtly. Most universities have a first-year writing course. Sometimes they have a set of required writing courses, but most schools have at least a first-year writing course as part of their general education requirements. And so the question is why? What is it supposed to do? I mean, obviously on the most basic, stupid, fundamental level, it's supposed to teach students to write. But that doesn't really answer the question, because there's a lot of different types of writing and a lot of different ways of writing and a lot of different purposes for writing. And so what kind of writing is it meant to teach them to do? Now, this is where things start to get tricky, because different programs have different purposes. They have different reasons that they want their they have different things that they want their students to get out of this or to be able to do based on taking a first-year writing course. And that's not a problem inherently, right? There's a lot of different ways you can set these classes up and a lot of different things you can try to achieve with them. But I think it's worth, as a sort of jumping off point, thinking about what students should be able to do by the end of a first-year writing course. So what I'm going to show you here, this is the Council of Writing Program Administrators WPA Outcome Statement for First-Year Composition 3.0, approved July 17th, 2014. This is one, not this version. I think I used to teach the old 2.0 version. But the Writing Program Administrator's Outcomes Statement is one that I actually used to teach my students, or I have had them read when I was at West Virginia University. Because one of the things that it does is it articulates the objectives for the course, the desired skill set, knowledge, perspective, worldview that this group, the Council of Writing Program Administrators, believe should be at the core of first-year writing programs. So I'm going to briefly talk through those, because this is a decent jumping off point for thinking about what we actually want these classes to do. But the thing that you will note, and I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, I am just going to talk through the high points, but the thing that you'll note, if you look through the WPA Outcomes Statement, what it doesn't actually tell you is why. Why should anyone care about this? And on one level, that's fair, right? These are writing program administrators. They have a vested financial and employment and disciplinary interest in ensuring that writing programs continue. And I do as well, as a faculty member who teaches writing at a university. I obviously have a personal interest in ensuring that these programs continue, but that's not a particularly compelling reason why we should have these courses, or what basis there is for requiring students to take them. And that's really what I'm interested in. So, but what the WPA outcome statement does that's really good is it gives us a foundational set of objectives that these courses should teach. And from there, we can start thinking about what the overall goal is, right? Why this thing? So the key things, they have 4 basic things: rhetorical knowledge, critical thinking, reading and composing, processes, and then for some reason it didn't get bolded and put in blue, but knowledge of conventions is the 4th. So rhetorical knowledge basically means an understanding of the tools available to persuade different types of audiences for different purposes and in different contexts. I've got tons and tons and tons of videos about various elements of rhetoric on this channel, but basically that is what it means, is the ability to identify rhetorical techniques and the ability to utilize rhetorical techniques, at least at a rudimentary level, in one's own writing. The second point, critical thinking, reading, and composing, involves analysis, evaluation, engagement with ideas, responding to and assessing different points, and providing comprehensive arguments about them. Processes. This is really about the composition side of things. How do you actually put together a strong argument? So things like outlining and then drafting, revising, all of this stuff, right? Peer reviewing, all of these different sort of stages of the writing process, along with the components of like, this is how you actually put together a strong thesis. What does a strong thesis look like, et cetera, et cetera. And then knowledge of conventions. This deals with the very sort of low-level editing type stuff of grammar and mechanics, but also things like citations, right? Making sure that you know how to cite correctly for different citation styles, right? How do you organize different types of writing? What are the different techniques in a personal narrative versus a scientific APA article, whatever it is, these kinds of things. And obviously students don't have to know all of those things, but they should know how to figure those things out. So the WPA outcome statement, I think, is really, really useful, in fact, for understanding the objectives of these types of courses. And on some level, I don't really like that. And the reason being that there has been a trend in higher education over the past several years, decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, something like that. I'm not really sure, of a movement toward learning objectives. And the problem with that is that they assume that learning or knowledge is measurable. And especially in the humanities, disciplines like writing, disciplines like English literature, the arts across the board, whether that's painting, sculpture, theater, whatever it is, history, these kinds of disciplines, knowledge is not always measurable in specific objective ways. It is subjective in that we deal with qualitative work rather than quantitative work. And so the objective orientation of higher ed seems to me to be really driven by a STEM mentality, to the detriment of the humanities and the arts. But again, that's probably a discussion for a different video. This video is about what we want our first-year comp courses to do. And so again, the WPA outcome statement does not articulate an objective for the courses as a whole. It doesn't say this should be what your courses focus on. It says here's a set of skills or knowledge that your students should get out of it. But again, there's a lot of different ways to approach that. So different programs come up with different focuses or different orientations for what type of writing or what worldview, what sort of meta purpose they want their instructors to convey to students. And again, I don't think this is a bad thing. I think it's perfectly fine that there are these different approaches. What I think becomes problematic is when either a program does not define a specific focus that they want the courses to have, when it defines multiple purposes that don't necessarily lend themselves to course coherence, or when it defines a particular purpose but then constructs the requirements of its program in a way that are inconsistent with those. So I want to tell you what I actually mean by this, right? The idea of different purposes. So I have either worked in writing programs or learned about a number of different objectives or goals. I don't want to say objectives because I did just critique the idea of objectives, but ways of orienting first-year comp courses. So one is as what we call a service course, where the objective of first-year writing classes is to teach students to write for other courses, right? So you need to be able to write a thesis because your history essays are going to demand that you have a thesis. You need to be able to incorporate evidence because the lab reports and stuff that you write for your bio classes are going to require that you present evidence and then explain what it means, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the idea of a service course, right? It is a course that is in service to other courses. And on some level, that's a good thing, right? Because with gen eds, students are typically not that interested in taking them for their own sake. And this is one of the big problems that we have in first-year comp, is that students basically don't often want to be in this class. And I don't begrudge them that, right? Like, it's a gen ed course, and many people would prefer not to take gen ed. It's totally fine. But the idea of first-year comp being a service course makes a lot of intuitive sense in terms of selling it to students, because the argument there is you will succeed better in your other courses if you have the skills that we are teaching you. The limitation of this, of course, is that it devalues rhetoric and composition in its own right. What it tells students, implicitly or explicitly, is that what we are teaching you has no intrinsic value. It is only valuable to the extent that you can use it in other courses. And if you end up not using it in other courses, if your history classes have exams rather than essays, if your science classes don't ask you to write lab reports, then the value of first-year comp disappears in that scheme. So I think this is a troubling one for those two reasons. One is it depends on others actually using the service we provide. And two is rhetoric and composition, if they matter because they are intrinsically of value, not because they are useful for something else. But that's one way that some comp programs orient their first-year writing classes, is that this is a service course meant to build skills for other classes. And I think not necessarily across the board, but I think often programs like WAC and WID, so WAC is an acronym for Writing Across the Curriculum, WID is an acronym for Writing in the Disciplines, and these, I don't know how much they're still sort of current in writing program thought, but basically these are programs that are intended to connect first-year composition courses or composition courses more broadly to other specific classes or to other specific disciplines, right? So like you might take a class, you rather than taking a general first-year comp course, you might take a first-year comp course on writing in chemistry or writing for sociology, whatever it is, however specific and broken up it is. It might be something like the English 202s here at Penn State, where it's writing in the social sciences, writing in the humanities, technical writing, business writing, something like that, right? Where it's broken up by sort of broad genres of things, but whatever it is. So that seems to me, and I'm not a whack or wid specialist. It's never something that I've taught in. It's never something that I've been sort of specifically trained for. But my sense is that it is built out of the service course mentality. So that's one approach, service courses. There are programs that specifically orient themselves, and also if the focus is academic writing, that tends to be a service course approach, right? There are programs that orient themselves towards civic rhetoric, we might call it, right? The idea that rhetoric matters in a democratic society, the way that we build arguments, the way that we present information, engaging in discussions of public policy, of local governance, of what kind of policies should be adopted within our workplaces, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea here becomes that we are trying to train citizens, and we are trying to train people who can engage critically and effectively with the world around them in order to make changes to the world around them. And I think this is generally quite a good ethical approach. I think we need especially in this country, the United States, I think we very much need a citizenry that is more critically engaged, more skeptical, not in the sense of automatically disbelieving something just because it comes from a figure of authority, but in the sense of I am seeking the truth and I am following the best evidence to get to that truth. But that's a skill set, right? That is a thing that people can be trained to do more effectively. And so I think that from a civic perspective, that is an extraordinarily important thing. I think it's also a harder thing to sell students on. Students, particularly at universities where they are paying quite a large amount of money, are not necessarily paying that money because they want to become better citizens. They are paying that money often, and this is supported by polling data among students, because they want a better job. And saying, but I'll make you a better citizen, does not necessarily translate in their minds to you will earn more money in your job. So the pitfall of that one, the biggest pitfall that I see is many students are unlikely to really be sold on that as a worthwhile endeavor. The same problem actually goes for the next way that writing programs can orient themselves, which is about self-exploration and expression. This goes back to a thing developed in the 60s, I think, called expressivist pedagogy, which is about, again, self-expression, self-exploration, sort of figuring out how you view the world, how you see yourself, and how you position yourself within a society, within different value systems, belief systems, ways of looking at the world, et cetera, et cetera. And this is extraordinarily useful for becoming I don't want to say better person because that sounds judgmental, but for becoming a more critically self-aware person, right? Because all of us have things in our lives about us, about our personality, et cetera, where we do things because they seem normal to us, and we don't think about why we do them the way we do them. We do them because it intuitively feels right. And part of what expressivist pedagogy was all about, and I think there's very few schools that do this at this stage. I think in 2025, this sort of hippie, new agey ethos of self-expression has largely been destroyed, which on some level is quite unfortunate. Right, but the idea of this was to sort of train us to say, well, yeah, I mean, I believe this. My parents told me to believe this, but do I really believe it? Is it what I feel is true? And so it became, in a way, a sort of mechanism for not just individual self-discovery, but also almost for communal change, right? So you looked at things like, you think about things like the civil rights movement, right? This was a mass turning against a social norm that had been held for decades. And it required people individually to sort of say, well, yeah, my society teaches me this thing, but I don't agree with it. And so that self-interrogation could really, really help with that, right? With changing social mores, with changing things that, people believe because we've been told by previous generations to believe them. Again, you run into the same problem when university is characterized as job training, which is not, by the way, and I will probably make a video on that if I haven't already. I don't think I have. Then the goal of self-exploration loses a lot of its value, right? If I, as a first-year student, say, I am not here to explore myself or to develop my interior world. I am here to get a better job, and this kind of stuff is not going to get me there, then it's very hard to build student engagement with that. And so again, it becomes this problem, this practical problem. Because, of course, if students are not engaged, if they don't see the value of our courses, if they don't believe that what we're doing matters, then we can be the best, most amazing teachers in the world. But if students aren't engaged, they aren't going to get anything out of it. So any purpose we set up for these courses is doomed to fail without student buy-in. And I don't know how to avoid that. Right? I don't think there is a way necessarily that we as individual instructors can deal with that, right? What we kind of would need, I think, is a larger sociocultural transformation of how we think about higher education back to something more akin to what it was in, say, the 50s and the 60s, where the objective was not for the vast majority of students who, let's be frank, were much more financially privileged than today's average student, in part because a larger percentage of our population gets higher education, and in part because for the vast majority of Americans since the 1970s, wealth has gone down, and that's just objectively, measurably true. But this is all sort of a divergence, right? But in the 50s and the 60s, the massive majority of students polled said that the main reason that they went to university was to better understand themselves, to engage with big ideas, to explore the world in a more critical, careful, and expansive way. By, I think it was the early 2000s, the numbers had switched from 75% of students saying the main reason they came to university was to gain knowledge and self-exploration, with 25% or so saying it was primarily for a job. Those numbers switched from the early 70s to the early 2000s, where 75% of students said that the main reason they came to university was to get a better job. That's not what university is about. University is not a system built for that. It's not a system that does that efficiently. And again, I will make a video about that specifically. But we as individual instructors cannot convince students who have been sort of steeped in a culture that tells them, go to university, get a better job. We cannot necessarily convince them that writing is important in and of itself, because expression is important, because expression is one of the most fundamental parts of the human experience, or because it's important to understand yourself in these careful and critical ways, or because it's important to engage in society and be an active, critical member of society, right? If they fundamentally don't believe that those things are important, or don't believe they are of primary importance, then we aren't going to get student buy-in. And again, I don't know that there's anything we can do about that, right? We on an individual instructor level cannot change deep-seated beliefs established through socio-cultural norms and conceptions. What we can attempt to do is to talk about writing and the skills that we're teaching, the rhetorical knowledge, the process knowledge, the conventional knowledge, etc., in, I think, a multitude of ways. So what I tend to talk about with my students is, this will be useful for your other classes in this way, this will be useful in your professional life in this way, this will be useful as citizens of your communities, of the world, of your country, whatever it is, in these ways. And I try to talk about those things on a wide range of levels. The risk of that, and on some level I think this isn't an ideal situation or an ideal solution to the problem, is that it means that the class is not that clearly defined in terms of what kind of writing they are supposed to be learning. Is the goal of this to train them to be better citizens? Is the goal of this to train them to explore themselves and express themselves? Is the goal of this to teach them to write for their major classes or something else? Whatever it is. And I think that is in many ways a disservice to the writing course, to let its purpose become so muddied that it's not clear where and why. It's not clear what exactly students should be getting out of this, how they should be viewing the world as writers.